This is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who's been commonly referred to his initials FDR. FDR was the 32nd President of the United States, and he is arguably a man who shifted the political landscape of the United States more than any other public figure of the 20th century. FDR was a vastly popular figure in the United States who was elected to 4 terms as President of the United States, and he served as president for roughly 12 years, and he didn't have a chance to fully serve out his 4th term because he shortly died 2 months into his final term. FDR was a man who largely shifted the Democratic Party from a party that used to represent conservative Southerners to a party that now represented working class Americans in urbanized and industrialized cities. FDR also presided over a time of economic recovery from the Great Depression, as well as he led the United States in the war effort against Nazi Germany. The Democratic Party before FDR, as I stated before, was largely a conservative party that was based in the southern United States, with a few roots in the north, but it largely had the support of Southerners. However, when FDR was president, he largely changed the Democratic Party from a party of the South to a party of more working class Americans, while the South still did remain a Democrat stronghold long after FDR's presidency. The seeds had finally begun sowing for the Democratic Party to become more and more liberal, and thus it would start to become alienated from the South. So that brings a fundamental question: what if FDR was never elected president? And is there any scenario where FDR would not be elected president, or he wouldn't even run for president? Well, there actually is a scenario, and that is that FDR's health concerns become so much of a problem that he just doesn't run for president in 1928. It's well known that FDR had polio, and he in fact had many health diseases as a child, and even when he was president of the United States, that he had worked really hard to conceal from the public. And in 1928, in 1932, his health issues if they had just become too much of a concern for him, he would likely just not run for president of the United States in the first place. So then who would the Democrats nominate to challenge the vastly unpopular Herbert Hoover? Well, the only opponent to FDR in the 1932 election, or really strong opponent, was Al Smith, who was previously the nominee 4 years ago in 1928, and who also served as governor of New York. Al Smith was in many ways a conservative Democrat, but despite this, he did not gain the support of the South, and the South largely despised him, mostly because of his links to Tammany Hall, as well as the fact he was a conservative, or not that he was a conservative, but that he was an Irish Catholic. He was an Irish Catholic American, which largely alienated many members of the South who were Protestant. That led to Al Smith suffering in the 1928 election, and by suffering, I mean he got beaten in a landslide by Herbert Hoover. And I don't think the Democratic Party would choose to nominate Al Smith again in 1932, regardless of the opposition. So who would the Democrats nominate then? Probably William Gibbs McAdoo, who later served as Senator of California and was largely a much more liberal member of the party than Al Smith. Though he wasn't quite as liberal as FDR, he still was a member of the more progressive wing of the party, and he actually had the support of both the South and the West, and he likely would have used his support to defeat Al Smith in 1932. Now, William Gibbs McAdoo was also a polarizing figure, particularly in the 1924 Democratic Convention, when he was unable to get a majority despite having a plurality of the delegates for almost every single ballot before eventually they had to settle on a compromise candidate. But McAdoo was largely harmed by the fact that he had an association with a man named Edward Doheny, who largely hurt his campaign because of the corruption linked to Doheny. However, in 1932, I think the Democratic Party would largely be behind this. It would be more focused on defeating Al Smith and then defeating Herbert Hoover in November than it would be on McAdoo's past connections to Doheny. So anyway, this would likely be the result if McAdoo ran against Hoover, which would be McAdoo would effectively sweep almost every single state. He wouldn't do quite as well as FDR did, but he still would beat Hoover in a landslide, largely because of the fact that the 1932 election, basically regardless of who the Democrats put up, so long as it wasn't Al Smith, they likely would have won the election against Herbert Hoover by a landslide. and McAdoo was no exception to this. So as President of the United States, I think McAdoo would choose his vice president to be David Ignatius Walsh. Now, Walsh was largely a member of the much more conservative wing of the party. He was, in fact, the Democrat governor of Massachusetts, which was a Republican stronghold at the time. And with FDR's election to the presidency, however, Massachusetts became much more of a Democratic swing state, of a Democrat state, than a Republican state. And FDR's presidency really transformed New England just as much as the presidency of LBJ transformed the South. So, anyway, David Walsh would likely be the nominee of McAdoo to compensate for McAdoo's struggling in the cities and lack of support in the northeastern part of the United States. So, when it comes to the banks, I think when it came to the Great Depression overall, McAdoo would have mostly done the same stuff as Roosevelt, which would be to implement more banking regulations. However, he probably wouldn't have gone as far as Roosevelt did, likely due to the fact that McAdoo was not as progressive when it came to economics as Roosevelt was. And I think McAdoo would still establish Social Security, given the fact that he voted for the bill that would establish Social Security. I think if Congress brought that bill up to his desk, McAdoo wouldn't hesitate to veto it. And just as I said earlier, with banking regulations, I think the Glass-Steagall Act would still be passed and signed into law. Mostly the same legislation would be signed by McAdoo as much as Roosevelt. However, a place where things would definitely be different between McAdoo and Roosevelt would be social liberalism and social conservatism. I think when it came to social issues, McAdoo was definitely a much more conservative member of the Democratic Party. He largely had the backing of the South in his 1924 run for president, and this would continue in his 1932 run for president. And McAdoo was also a strong supporter of prohibition, and I think the bill that would overall outlaw prohibition that was signed by FDR, this bill would not be signed by McAdoo. Even if Congress passed the bill, McAdoo would likely veto it given his strong support for prohibition. Also, when it came down to the issue of lynchings, unlike FDR, who sort of gave lip service to the issue, McAdoo wouldn't really do the same, given the fact that he largely had the same racial views as many in the South did at the time, and in many ways he was a white supremacist. In fact, he and Woodrow Wilson had largely cooperated in their efforts to segregate the Treasury Department and many other executive departments in the United States, and McAdoo largely held the same opinions as Wilson regarding race. So, as president, McAdoo would largely be not as fiscally progressive, but he still would have a degree of fiscal liberalism. However, when it came to social issues, McAdoo would definitely be a lot more conservative than Roosevelt. And another thing which McAdoo would definitely be different than Roosevelt is the fact that Roosevelt had carried out an unprecedented amount of executive orders during his time as president. I don't believe that McAdoo would have done the same. In the 1936 presidential election, Republicans would actually have a significant shot of beating McAdoo than they did under Roosevelt, largely because of the fact that McAdoo was not as popular among the Americans as Roosevelt would be. And unlike FDR, who had a largely unified party behind him, McAdoo would not, given the fact that he would barely clinch the Democrat nomination in 1932 in the scenario. And with that, Republicans would probably nominate someone who would be just as progressive, if not even more progressive than McAdoo. This would be in the form of William Borah, a Republican from the state of Idaho, who in fact ran in 1936 but couldn't get enough support to win, and thus the Republican Party settled on Alf Landon, who got destroyed by FDR. I think William Borah would be a much better candidate than Landon. He would actually actively campaign, and he would also be from the more liberal wing of the Republican Party, so the Democrats couldn't really establish him as tied to Hoover and the Great Depression. And as for his running mate, I think Borah would likely pick someone much more conservative than him from the conservative wing of the party, so that it would balance out. And I think as a whole, Borah would likely win the election, although very narrowly, against McAdoo. And I think McAdoo would overall lose in 1936 because he wouldn't have as much of a unified base behind him as FDR did, and he wouldn't be as popular as FDR. Plus, given the fact that the economic recovery was actually slow under FDR, and that FDR was largely able to win largely because he had a much more charisma, and he was much more popular, like optics-wise, than someone like McAdoo was or someone like Alf Landon was. I think William McAdoo would probably lose the 1936 election, although narrowly he would still lose it. So that would lead to a president, William Borah. So largely, when it came to the issues, William Borah was a progressive Republican. He was in favor of the New Deal and voted for many New Deal legislations that Roosevelt had signed into law. However, at the same time, Borah did have his limits when it came to his progressivism, and he did actually oppose some of the much more controversial aspects of Roosevelt's New Deal, particularly the Second New Deal, which Roosevelt had tried to get passed into law in his second term. However, one key distinction that Borah would have from FDR, which would not only be the fact that the Second New Deal would have never come into place or even been attempted, but Borah also would have largely opposed any kind of United States involvement in World War II in in 1930s in the early 1940s. Borah would largely, in fact, he would oppose any kind of aid or any sort of selling of equipment to the United Kingdom or any of the Allied forces, which Roosevelt, although Roosevelt did remain neutral, he still did in fact sell many arms and food and equipment towards the Allied powers. I think Borah would largely stay completely neutral in World War II, unlike Roosevelt. Also, when it came to the relationship between Adolf Hitler and FDR, Adolf Hitler in fact despised Roosevelt. This was long before Roosevelt even declared war on Nazi Germany, or I'm sorry, Nazi Germany declared war on the United States. This was long before that even happened, and FDR and Hitler did not even like each other from the get-go. I think with Borah things would definitely be different. While William Borah definitely did not have an admiration for Hitler, didn't even like Hitler, I think Hitler would be much less hostile towards Borah than he would be towards Roosevelt. Also, when it came to money and spending on the war, I don't think Borah would have spent any money whatsoever or given any aid to the Allied powers. And when it came to the economic recovery that the United States had from the Great Depression, that was largely because of the selling of equipment and arms to the Allied powers in World War II. This would never have happened, so the United States' recovery from the Great Depression would in fact still remain very slow. So the other issue is that William Borah was also very old and his public health was deteriorating by the time of the late 1930s, and he in fact died shortly after 19 he in fact died in 1940. So I don't really know if he would survive the remainder of his term. Whether or not he did, his replacement would be would be his running mate, which would be the much more conservative. It was from the much more conservative wing of the party. This would be Senator Arthur Vandenberg from Michigan. Anyway, Vandenberg was definitely much more conservative than Borah, and he actually was an isolationist until the Cold War and the dropping of the atomic bomb, or sorry, the bombing of Pearl Harbor by Japan on the United States. Ever since Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, Vandenberg became much more internationalist. However, that brings the question, he likely would not have still gotten involved in World War II, because in this scenario, Nazi Germany would have been a lot less hostile towards the United States, and thus, as a whole, I believe that the Empire of Japan would actually not launch that surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, because the United States would not have been such a nuisance when it came to Japan trying to conquer the entire Pacific. So the bombing of Pearl Harbor in this scenario would likely never occur in the first place. So the United States would never get involved in World War II, and that also brings the question of civil rights. So civil rights in the United States was becoming a big issue around this time period, and without FDR really shifting the Democratic Party towards the left, the Democratic Party would not be as much of a strong force when it came to civil rights as it was in our own scenario, and there would have been very lukewarm support for civil rights in both parts of the party, given how Republicans had largely abandoned the black voter base after the 1880s. So, as a whole, though, when it came to World War II, I think that Nazi Germany, no matter what, still would not have won the war, largely because of how weak Hitler was as a leader regarding Nazi Germany and the rash decisions that Hitler would make. I still believe that Nazi Germany would have lost World War II even if America was never involved. It may have been delayed by a longer period of time. However, still Nazi Germany would not win the war. And overall, when it came to the issue of civil rights, I think this would be an issue that would be kicked down the can much later down the line. And civil rights is basically inevitable as racial attitudes, not just in the United States, but across the entire world, would improve, and the United States would be forced to change at some point. But this would largely be probably delayed even further into the 1980s and the 1990s, which is much later than our own scenario. And also, given the Cold War with the Soviet Union, I think that the Cold War would still occur in our own timeline just because of how different communism and the whole American ideals were, but it would largely be a lot less open because as a whole the United States would become much more isolationist and non-interventionist in this scenario. But there definitely would be conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. And as a whole, when it comes down to the Democratic Party, many people think that the Democratic Party shifted to the left because of LBJ's signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act, but that was really because of FDR and the New Deal that largely spurned the Democratic Party shift towards the left, and as well as the fact that many labor unions and many labor unions, as well as industry leaders, then began becoming more and more democratic. And then when it came to the Republican Party, which was largely a party of northern mercantilists in the 1900s, this would likely remain the same in our own scenario because it largely became a much more conservative party in opposition to FDR and the New Deal. And this also allowed it to become the party of Southerners later on when the Democratic Party became much more socially liberal. And the social liberalism came as a result of the fiscal liberalism. So as a whole, both political parties would be exactly how they were in the 1900s, which would be they would have two wings of the party, one liberal wing and one conservative wing, and these two wings would be competing for power. And the South, Democrats would still remain prominent, and in the North, Republicans would still remain prominent, particularly in New England. So as a whole, the two-party system is vastly shifted, and both parties would still have a conservative and liberal wing of their respective parties. And when it comes to international politics, I think the Soviet Union would still exist in our own scenario because the United States becoming internationalist was a direct result of FDR and World War II, and the Soviet Union would still exist now, even though there would largely be a lot of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the United States would not really have a status as the policeman of the world that it does today. So as a whole, the United States is probably not the quote number one country in the world. It would largely be a country that sort of minds its own business for the most part, much more non-interventionist. So anyway, those are the effects of the United States if FDR is never president. Make sure to like this video down below and subscribe to the channel.